my family story. My grandfather was born in 1920. Therefore, in accordance with Japan's conscription law at the time, he was drafted into the army in 1940 and sent to the mainland at the height of the Second Sino-Japanese War. My grandfather eventually died of stomach cancer at the end of the year during the winter of my 5th year of elementary school. But I heard many stories about the war from him and his son, my father. My grandfather fought in Central and North China and was in Mukodan, Manchuria at the end of the war. The purpose of the mission was to gather soldiers and send reinforcements to Okinawa, which was under attack by the US military. However, in 1945, the Japanese military had lost control of the sea and all of its transport ships were being sunk, so it was unable to go to Okinawa to help. However, if my grandfather and his Okinawan reinforcements had arrived in time, he would undoubtedly have been killed in action. And my father, myself, my siblings, and their children would never have existed. Eventually, the Japanese military was defeated, and my grandfathers accepted this and began to disarm. Then, the Soviet army broke the Japan-Soviet Neutrality Pact and advanced south. Russian soldiers robbed Manchuria of everything Japan had built up until then. Looting, massacres of civilians, rape, forced deportations, all of them the same as what is happening in Ukraine today. My grandfather's troop, which was in the process of disarming, was unable to resist and was forced to board a train. Despite the Russian soldiers telling them they were returning home, their deception soon became apparent. The train was heading north. My grandfather and his friends underwent harsh slave labor in Siberia, and 2 years later, 10% of them died of exhaustion. My grandfather barely managed to return to Japan from the port of Nahotoga via the port of Maizuru. My grandfather's father, my great-grandfather, had already passed away in 1942. So my grandfather's mother and sister were the only women running our farming family. However, even though the war had ended, my grandfather did not return for 2 years, and there was no news from him. My family assumed he had been killed in action, so they were very happy to welcome him back. Soon after returning to Japan, my grandfather took a wife, my grandmother, and my father was born. In other words, I am here today because my grandfather survived the Russian tyranny. But this is not the only hardship facing my family. The same thing happened to my maternal great-grandfather, my mother's maternal grandfather. My great-grandfather was also detained in Siberia and forced to work as a slave in Irkutsk on the shores of Lake Baikal. In mourning his harsh experience, my aunt, my mother's cousin, went to Irkutsk when Russia was still at peace and visited the graves of my aunt's father's war comrades. I would also love to go to Siberia and mourn for my grandfather and great-grandfather, but with the KGB targeting us, that may be an impossible dream. Let me tell you one more history about my grandfather's grandfather. He served in the Russo-Japanese War about 120 years ago. He fought in the Battle of Port Arthur as a soldier in General Nogi Maresuke's Third Army. It may be hard to imagine today with global warming on the rise, but Port Arthur was cold at the time, and it is said that during the winter battles, hand towels would freeze by the time soldiers returned from the bath to the barracks. In other words, my family has always been at war with Russia, and I would like you Europeans to understand that this has not only been a European issue, but also a fateful defensive war in the Far East. Ever since Russia began its aggressive expansion. Here, I would like to cite the Crimean War as a reference from the past and present. As you all know, the Crimean War was not a war waged in isolation. While experts differ on how to define the period, I would trace its beginnings to the Northern War or Great Northern War. While Sweden, where you are, played a major role in those wars, Russia was the unsung villain. Since the early modern period, Russia has traditionally invaded various parts of the world in search of ice-free ports and access to the ocean. However, there has been only a few outlets for Russia to reach the ocean. The route from the Baltic Sea to the North Sea, which was an issue during the Northern War, and the route from the Black Sea via the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles to the Mediterranean, which was an issue during the Crimean War, were issues. Another possible route would be via Murmansk or Arkhangelsk to the Arctic Ocean. However, those would only take us to Europe. There's been another route, which would later take us from Vladivostok via the Sea of Japan, or at that time, directly to the North Pacific from the Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. Of these, the Baltic Sea route and the route from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean via the Bosphorus Strait were blocked due to Russia's inferior position during the Crimean War. Incidentally, the Battle of Sevastopol took place at this time shares many similarities with the later Battle of Port Arthur during the Russo-Japanese War. Traditionally, in Japan, it's said that the Battle of Fort Santiago during the Spanish-American War served as a model for the Battle of Port Arthur. But in my opinion, the Battle of Sevastopol during the Crimean War was more likely to have been a useful model for Japan in the future. Those of you with an understanding of military history are encouraged to weigh in. However, at the time, the route from Petropavlovsk to the North Pacific was not blocked, so fearing an attack on Canada, the British and French forces temporarily occupied the port and blocked the route in that direction. At that time, Japan was in the final days of Tokugawa shogunate, and Russian Vice Admiral Puchatin was negotiating with Japan to open the country. However, when Puchatin learned that British and French forces were approaching the Far East, he hurried to begin diplomatic negotiations with Japan. This resulted in the Japan-Russia Treaty of Peace and Amity, which recognized the entire island of Karafuto, as Japanese territory. Japan realized that it would be difficult to repel Russia on its own, so it asked for the intervention and mediation of Britain, which was hostile to Russia. This decision was correct, and the temporary diplomatic and military law was maintained between Russia and Japan. At that time, American Commodore Perry took advantage of the chaos in Europe and arrived in Edo Bay to negotiate with Japan, which had maintained a policy of isolation, to open its ports. Japan decided to open diplomatic relations with the United States to balance the gap between Russia and Britain. At the same time, Japan revised its isolationist policy, which prohibited the construction of large ships. It was decided that Japan would need a navy for national defense, and a naval training school was established in Nagasaki. This shows that Europe and the Far East already had close military and diplomatic ties in the 19th century. This remains true today. The Baltic Sea, Russia's gateway for trade and naval traffic, was effectively blocked when Sweden and Finland, non-neutral nations, joined NATO. The same was true for the route from the Black Sea through the Bosphorus to the Mediterranean. However, while the Japanese Navy can block the route from Vladivostok to the Pacific Ocean via the Sea of Japan, the route from Petropavlovsk, a hotbed of nuclear submarines, to the North Pacific remained empty. Blockading Russia requires an expansion of the current Japanese Navy, cooperation from the US Navy, and the understanding and assistance of European countries. I would like to convey this to Japanese politicians and the people of Europe and the United States. I also like to further deepen cooperation between NATO and Japan. Currently, a proposal to establish a NATO liaison office in Tokyo has been rejected by French President Macron. This is ridiculous. For our liberal democracies, prioritizing trade interests and being too considerate to China and pandering to authoritarian countries does more harm than good. I ask everyone listening to this to put positive pressure on France. And now, with warm regard for Stockholm from Tsurugasi.